February 25th, 1991. 0347 hours, southern Iraq. The T-72 tank exploded from the inside out. Sergeant Hassan al-Rashidi watched through his periscope as the turret of the vehicle next to him launched 30 feet into the air, spinning like a coin flipped by an invisible giant. The ammunition inside detonated in a cascade of secondary explosions that turned the Soviet-made tank into a fountain of fire and molten steel. He never saw what hit them, but he heard it. That sound. A sound unlike anything in his 20 years of military service. Not the whistle of artillery, not the crack of tank guns. Something else entirely. A deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Like industrial machinery tearing through sheet metal. Like a monster clearing its throat before swallowing you whole. 3 seconds later, another tank in his platoon erupted into flames. Then another. And another. Hassan threw open his hatch and dove into the sand. Behind him, his own tank took a direct hit. 30mm depleted uranium rounds punched through the roof armor like needles through paper. The crew he had trained with for 4 years died instantly. He lay face down in the dirt, hands over his head, listening to that terrible sound fade into the distance. When he finally looked up, he saw it. A strange aircraft silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. Twin engines mounted high on the fuselage. A distinctive twin tail that Iraqi soldiers would learn to call by a different name. The Devil's Cross. In the 42 days of Operation Desert Storm, 144 of these aircraft would destroy more than 900 Iraqi tanks, 2,000 military vehicles, and 1,200 artillery pieces. They would fly 8,100 combat missions with a 95% success rate. They would become the single most effective tank-killing weapon system in modern warfare. And Iraqi tank crews, men trained to fight and die against American M1 Abrams tanks, would learn to fear this aircraft more than any ground vehicle ever built. This is the story of the A-10 Thunderbolt II. The aircraft the Americans called the Warthog. The weapon that turned Soviet tank doctrine into a death sentence. And the sound that haunted every Iraqi tanker who survived to tell the tale. You could hear it coming, but hearing it meant nothing, because by the time that sound reached your ears, you were already dead. To understand why Iraqi tank crews feared the A-10 more than the legendary M1 Abrams, you must first understand what they were trained to expect. Soviet military doctrine dominated Iraqi tactical thinking. For decades, Iraqi officers had studied at Soviet academies. They learned Soviet tactics. They operated Soviet equipment. They believed in Soviet principles of armored warfare. And Soviet doctrine taught them exactly how to fight against Western tanks. The theory was straightforward. American tanks possessed superior optics, better ammunition, and more advanced fire control systems. In a straight fight at long range, Soviet-designed tanks would lose. Everyone knew this. The Soviets knew it. The Iraqis knew it. It was simply accepted fact. But Soviet doctrine provided answers. Close the distance. Use terrain for concealment. Overwhelm with numbers. Coordinate ambushes from multiple angles. Attack the flanks and rear where armor was thinner. These tactics required skill, discipline, and coordination that Iraqi forces often lacked. But they existed. They were written in manuals. Officers taught them. Crews practiced them. When Iraqi tank commanders looked at the M1 Abrams, they saw a formidable enemy. They saw a vehicle that could destroy their T-72s at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters. They saw depleted uranium ammunition that punched through their armor with contemptuous ease. They saw thermal imaging systems that found them in darkness and through smoke. But they also saw a tank, a ground vehicle, something that operated on the same horizontal plane where their training had meaning. Something they could, at least theoretically, fight back against. The Abrams had to find you first. The Abrams had to maneuver into position. The Abrams needed favorable terrain, clear fields of fire, logistical support. The Abrams was dangerous, absolutely. But it was a danger Iraqi tankers understood. They did not understand what was coming from above. Soviet tank design philosophy accepted certain compromises. Frontal armor on the T-72 measured 500 to 600 millimeters of effective protection against kinetic energy penetrators. This was substantial. This could defeat many Western anti-tank weapons when vehicles were properly positioned in hull-down defensive fighting positions. Side armor measured 80 millimeters on the hull, enough to stop 20 millimeter and even 25 millimeter autocannon rounds, enough to provide reasonable protection against infantry fighting vehicles and light armor. But top armor? The steel protecting turret roofs and engine decks from attacks coming from directly above? 30 to 40 millimeters of rolled steel, barely enough to stop artillery fragments. Designed to minimize weight rather than provide protection against direct hits. Soviet designers made this choice deliberately. Their doctrine assumed that air superiority would be established before ground operations commenced. Their doctrine assumed that integrated air defense systems would create protective umbrellas over armored formations. Their doctrine assumed that enemy ground attack aircraft would face such withering fire that low-altitude operations would be suicidal. Under these assumptions, heavy top armor became wasted weight. Better to invest that tonnage in frontal protection, where tank versus tank engagements would actually occur. Better to accept thin top armor and trust the air defense network to handle threats from above. This assumption would prove fatal. The Americans understood this vulnerability. They had studied Soviet tank design for decades. They knew about the thin top armor. They knew about the doctrinal assumptions. And in the late 1960s, they decided to build a weapon specifically designed to exploit this weakness. The requirement called for a 30-millimeter rapid-fire cannon optimized for destroying Soviet armor. General Electric delivered something unprecedented: a 7-barrel Gatling gun capable of firing between 2,100 and 4,200 rounds per minute, eventually standardized at 3,900 rounds per minute for operational use. The weapon measured more than 6 meters in length. It weighed 281 kilograms without ammunition. These dimensions were so substantial that engineers faced an unusual problem. They could not fit this gun into any existing aircraft. So they did something that had never been done before. They designed an entire aircraft around the gun. The A-10 Thunderbolt II did not carry the GAU-8 Avenger cannon. The A-10 was the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, with wings attached. Every design decision revolved around making the gun work effectively. Original concepts positioned the cannon on the aircraft centerline, beneath the fuselage. Testing revealed that recoil forces pushed the aircraft off target during sustained fire. The gun was so powerful, it literally shoved the plane sideways. Engineers remounted the entire weapon offset to the left, with only the firing barrel aligned with the aircraft centerline. This solved the accuracy problem while creating the distinctive asymmetric nose profile that became the Warthog's visual signature. The ammunition drum held 1,174 rounds. Combat loadouts mixed armor-piercing incendiary rounds with high-explosive incendiary rounds in 5-to-1 ratios. The armor-piercing rounds incorporated depleted uranium penetrator cores, pencil-diameter rods of uranium alloy that offered densities 68% greater than lead. When fired at muzzle velocities exceeding 1,000 meters per second, these projectiles could penetrate 69 millimeters of hardened steel armor at 500 meters range, at angles striking nearly perpendicular to the surface. Remember what protected Iraqi tank turrets from above? 30 to 40 millimeters of rolled steel. The GAU-8 could penetrate nearly twice that thickness. From attack angles where Iraqi armor provided almost no protection. At ranges where Iraqi air defenses struggled to engage effectively. But the most terrifying aspect of this weapon was not its penetration capability. It was not the depleted uranium ammunition. It was not even the staggering rate of fire that delivered 65 rounds per second. It was the sound. The physics of the GAU-8 created an acoustic signature unlike any other weapon in modern warfare. 7 barrels spinning at tremendous speed, rounds leaving the muzzle at supersonic velocity. The entire mechanical process generating a frequency that human ears interpreted as something between an industrial saw and canvas being torn by giants. American soldiers called it the BERT, a phonetic approximation that captured the weapon's distinctive roar. They loved that sound. It meant close air support had arrived. It meant salvation. Iraqi tank crews learned a different interpretation. They called it the sound of the devil, the announcement that death approached, the last thing many of them would ever hear. The attack profile that A-10 pilots developed maximized both lethality and psychological impact. Approaching from altitudes around 10,000 to 12,000 feet, pilots would roll inverted to acquire targets through the canopy. Then they rolled upright and established dive angles between 20 and 40 degrees from horizontal. Stabilizing between 4,000 and 8,000 feet, pilots centered their continuously computed impact point over the target. Then they pressed the trigger. Even a 2-second burst delivered 130 rounds downrange. Dispersion patterns at 4,000 feet placed 80% of rounds within a 20-foot radius circle. Against vehicle-sized targets, multiple impacts occurred with devastating regularity. But here is what made the GAU-8 psychologically devastating, rather than merely physically lethal. The sound reached Iraqi tank crews in a specific sequence that maximized terror. First came the sight of the aircraft, that distinctive twin-engine profile, the straight wings carrying heavy weapons loads, the silhouette that Iraqi gunners learned to recognize instantly. Then came the sound, that industrial roar that seemed to grow louder with each passing second, a sound that penetrated tank armor and announced that death approached. But the sound traveled slower than the supersonic projectiles. By the time Iraqi crews heard the GAU-8 firing, the rounds were already in flight. By the time that terrible roar reached their ears, they had mere seconds to live. Some crews reported hearing the impacts before they heard the gun. Supersonic rounds striking earth and armor, followed a split second later by that monstrous roar, a sequence that violated their intuition about how weapons worked. A sequence that seemed almost supernatural. And then came the impacts themselves. 30-millimeter depleted uranium penetrators striking tank-top armor at velocities exceeding 1,000 meters per second. Punching through steel that was never designed to stop them. Entering crew compartments while still burning from pyrophoric effects. Igniting ammunition. Detonating propellant charges. Creating secondary explosions that often blew turrets completely off hulls. Iraqi crews who survived A-10 attacks consistently reported that once they heard that sound, they had seconds to abandon their vehicles or die inside them. The choice was not really a choice at all. Exiting a tank under fire in open terrain meant exposing yourself to follow-up attacks. But staying inside meant waiting for depleted uranium rounds to punch through the roof of your own vehicle. Most crews who heard that sound and lived to describe it afterward had been in vehicles not directly targeted. Tanks positioned near the actual target that witnessed the destruction without experiencing it personally. These survivors spread word through Iraqi defensive positions. The Americans had an aircraft specifically designed to kill tanks from above. It carried a cannon that could penetrate armor from angles where Soviet tanks were most vulnerable. And you could hear it coming. But hearing it meant nothing. Because by the time the sound reached you, the aircraft had already fired. The first operational tests of this doctrine came in the opening weeks of Desert Storm. A-10 squadrons received tasking to conduct armed reconnaissance missions throughout the Kuwaiti theater of operations. Their mission was simple: find Iraqi armor, destroy Iraqi armor, report results, repeat. The results exceeded even optimistic projections. In one engagement that would become legend among A-10 pilots, 2 aircraft launched from their forward operating base carrying full loads of AGM-65 Maverick missiles and 1,174 rounds of 30mm ammunition each. Their tasking directed them to conduct armed reconnaissance along Highway 8, northwest of Kuwait City. Intelligence reports indicated Republican Guard armor units were withdrawing toward Basra. The pilots located an Iraqi column consisting of T-72 and T-62 tanks, interspersed with armored personnel carriers, all moving northwest in organized formation. Thermal imaging revealed engines running hot, perfect targets. In 10 minutes, 6 tanks burned from Maverick strikes. With missiles expended but targets remaining, the pilots transitioned to cannon attacks. 2 more tanks exploded under GAU-8 fire. They returned to base, rearmed, and launched again. Their second mission that day encountered more intense resistance. A Marine Harrier had been shot down. Another was preparing to eject after taking hits. The warning indicated Iraqi air defenses remained active and dangerous. The A-10 pilots pressed the attack anyway. 8 more Iraqi tanks died under their guns. They landed, refueled, rearmed, and launched a third time. 7 more tanks burned before sunset. 23 tanks destroyed in a single day by 2 aircraft. For context, during World War II, a tank ace, someone credited with destroying 5 or more enemy tanks, represented rare achievement. These 2 pilots accomplished more than twice that total in missions spanning roughly 12 hours. But this was only the beginning. What Iraqi commanders did not yet understand was that their entire defensive strategy had been rendered obsolete. Everything they knew about armored warfare was about to become meaningless. Because the A-10 was not just a weapon, it was the physical manifestation of a fundamental truth that Soviet doctrine had failed to anticipate. When your enemy controls the sky, your tanks become coffins. In Part 2, we will see what happened when Iraqi forces attempted to counter this threat. We will witness the largest tank destruction campaign in modern history. We will learn why Iraqi crews began abandoning their vehicles the moment they heard that sound approaching. And we will discover the nickname they gave to the aircraft that hunted them: the Devil's Cross. In Part 1, we witnessed Iraqi tank crews face a nightmare they never trained for: the A-10 Thunderbolt II. An aircraft built around a 7-barrel cannon that fired depleted uranium rounds at 65 projectiles per second. We saw how Soviet tank doctrine crumbled when American air superiority turned T-72 tanks into steel coffins. We learned that Iraqi crews could hear the GAU-8 coming, but hearing it meant nothing. Now the question became simple. Could Iraqi forces find a way to survive? The answer would cost thousands of lives. Republican Guard commanders gathered in underground bunkers south of Basra during the third week of January 1991. Coalition airstrikes had been pounding Iraqi positions for days. Reports flooding in from Kuwait painted a picture of systematic destruction that defied everything Soviet doctrine had promised. General Salah Aboud Mahmoud studied the damage assessments with growing horror. 47 tanks destroyed in a single day along Highway 80. 32 more near the Kuwaiti oil fields. Artillery batteries wiped out before they could fire a single round. And everywhere, the same report from surviving crews. The aircraft with two tails. The sound like tearing metal. Death from above. Soviet advisors had assured Iraqi leadership that integrated air defenses would protect armored formations. ZSU-23-4 Shilka mobile gun systems would create walls of fire that no low-flying aircraft could penetrate. SA-6 and SA-8 missile batteries would force attackers to higher altitudes where accuracy decreased. The umbrella would hold. The umbrella had holes large enough to fly aircraft through. Coalition forces had spent the first week systematically dismantling Iraqi air defense networks. Radar installations destroyed by precision munitions. Missile batteries neutralized before they could achieve lock. Communication nodes severed, leaving individual air defense units blind and uncoordinated. By the time A-10's began their tank hunting missions, Iraqi air defenses existed only in isolated pockets. Dangerous to individual aircraft, certainly, but nowhere near sufficient to prevent the systematic destruction of armored formations across the entire theater. General Mahmoud demanded solutions. His staff offered theories. Disperse the tanks. Increase camouflage discipline. Move only at night. Concentrate air defense assets around the most critical armored units. None of these solutions addressed the fundamental problem. Iraqi tanks could not hide from thermal imaging that detected heat signatures through darkness and haze. Dispersal reduced target density, but also reduced combat power at any given defensive point. Night movement helped, but American pilots simply switched to infrared-guided Maverick missiles that found hot tank engines regardless of ambient light. And concentrating air defenses created new targets for coalition aircraft specifically hunting those systems. One staff officer suggested the only reliable countermeasure: abandon the tanks entirely. Fight as infantry. Remove the target that A-10's were designed to destroy. General Mahmoud dismissed him from the meeting. But the idea spread through Iraqi defensive positions anyway, not as official doctrine, as survival instinct. Tank crews began developing their own countermeasures. Some buried their vehicles up to the turret in sand berms, hoping to reduce thermal signatures and present smaller targets. This worked occasionally. It also rendered the tanks immobile and unable to reposition when ground forces approached. Others ran their engines only intermittently, allowing vehicles to cool between movements. This reduced thermal signatures, but also meant electrical systems failed, radios went dead, and crews sat in freezing darkness, waiting for dawn or death. The most desperate solutions spread through word of mouth among crews who had survived A-10 attacks. When you hear that sound, abandon the vehicle immediately. Do not wait for confirmation of targeting. Do not attempt to engage the aircraft. Simply run. This advice contradicted every principle of armored warfare. Tanks provided protection. Infantry in the open died to artillery, small arms, and air attack. Abandoning your vehicle meant abandoning your defensive position, your firepower, your purpose. But crews who followed this advice lived. Crews who remained inside their tanks died. The mathematics were brutally simple. February 24, 1991. Coalition ground forces crossed the line of departure and began the liberation of Kuwait. Iraqi defensive lines that had held for months began collapsing within hours. The air campaign had done its work. Now ground forces advanced to finish what aircraft had started. A-10 squadrons received expanded tasking. Armed reconnaissance became close air support. Tank hunting became battlefield interdiction. Every available warthog launched into skies that belonged entirely to coalition forces. The scale of destruction that followed exceeded anything in modern armored warfare. Along Highway 80, retreating Iraqi forces created a traffic jam that stretched for miles. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, trucks, civilian vehicles, all packed together in a desperate attempt to flee Kuwait before coalition ground forces cut off escape routes. A-10 pilots called it the Highway of Death. The attacks began before dawn and continued through the day. Aircraft cycled through kill boxes, expending ordnance, returning to base, rearming, and launching again within hours. Maverick missiles struck vehicles at the front and rear of columns, creating blockages that trapped everything in between. Then the guns went to work. GAU-8 cannon runs walked fire through packed formations where every burst found multiple targets. Vehicles exploded in chains as ammunition and fuel ignited. Crews who attempted to flee on foot found themselves caught in open terrain with nowhere to hide. By sunset, the highway had become a graveyard, stretching to the horizon. Burned hulks of tanks and trucks formed an unbroken line of destruction that reporters would photograph for front pages around the world. Iraqi survivors described scenes that defied comprehension. Men who had served in the Iran-Iraq War, who had experienced 8 years of brutal combat, said they had never witnessed anything approaching the concentrated violence of those hours on Highway 80. The sound never stopped. That terrible roar echoing across the desert as aircraft attacked formations kilometers away, crews waiting their turn, listening to death approach, knowing they would hear it before they saw it. Some Iraqi soldiers surrendered to the sound itself. They emerged from vehicles with hands raised when they heard A-10's in the area, preferring captivity to the certainty of what happened when that gun found you inside a tank. American ground forces advancing behind the airstrikes found abandoned vehicles everywhere, tanks with engines still running, personal effects scattered around fighting positions, weapons left behind in the rush to escape. Intelligence officers debriefing Iraqi prisoners documented consistent testimony. The aircraft with two tails inspired more fear than any other coalition weapon system, more than the Abrams tanks that outclassed Iraqi armor in every measurable way, more than the Apache helicopters that hunted vehicles with Hellfire missiles, more than the B-52 bombers that turned entire grid squares into cratered moonscapes. The A-10 was different. The A-10 was personal. When a B-52 struck, you never knew what hit you. The bombs fell from altitudes so high the aircraft remained invisible. Death arrived without warning, without sound, without any opportunity to contemplate what was happening. The A-10 announced itself. That distinctive silhouette, that unmistakable roar. You saw it coming. You heard it coming. You had just enough time to understand exactly what was about to happen before depleted uranium rounds punched through your roof armor. This combination of visibility and inevitability created psychological effects that pure lethality could not match. Iraqi crews gave the aircraft a name that captured their experience: the Devil's Cross. A reference to the distinctive twin-tail silhouette that appeared moments before the GAU-8 spoke. A name that acknowledged both the aircraft's appearance and its seemingly supernatural ability to kill. Some crews reported that the A-10 seemed to hunt them specifically, that pilots could somehow identify command vehicles or see individual tanks through armor. This was not true. A-10 pilots engaged targets of opportunity based on thermal signatures and visual identification. They had no way to distinguish a battalion commander's tank from any other T-72 in a formation. But the perception mattered more than reality. When soldiers believe they are being hunted by something that cannot be stopped, that knows where they hide, that announces its presence with the sound of death itself, unit cohesion collapses, regardless of training or discipline. By the fourth day of the ground offensive, Iraqi resistance had effectively ceased across most of the theater. Entire divisions surrendered rather than face continued air attack. Tank crews abandoned vehicles at the first sound of aircraft overhead, not waiting to confirm whether the approaching plane was an A-10 or something less lethal. The 100-hour ground war that liberated Kuwait represented the culmination of an air campaign that had already decided the outcome. Iraqi forces were defeated before the first American tank crossed the border. The ground offensive simply collected the wreckage. Final statistics told the story in numbers. A-10 aircraft destroyed more than 900 Iraqi tanks during Desert Storm. They destroyed 2,000 additional military vehicles and 1,200 artillery pieces. They flew 8,100 combat sorties, with mission-capable rates exceeding 95%. For comparison, the entire Iraqi tank force in the theater numbered approximately 4,000 vehicles at the start of hostilities. A-10s alone destroyed nearly a quarter of that total. But statistics cannot capture what Iraqi survivors carried with them after the war ended. Veterans interviewed in the years following Desert Storm described recurring nightmares featuring that sound, the industrial roar that meant death approached. Some reported being unable to tolerate mechanical noise that reminded them of the GAU-8. Power tools, industrial equipment, anything that produced that grinding metallic quality triggered memories they could not escape. They had entered Kuwait believing their Soviet tanks made them formidable opponents. They left, understanding that modern warfare had changed in ways their doctrine never anticipated. Air superiority was not merely an advantage. It was everything. Without it, ground forces became targets rather than combatants. The lessons spread beyond Iraqi military circles. Tank forces worldwide studied Desert Storm engagements. They analyzed why Iraqi armor performed so poorly. They identified the same vulnerability in their own equipment. Top armor protection received renewed attention. Active defense systems, capable of intercepting incoming projectiles, entered accelerated development. Doctrine evolved to emphasize the catastrophic consequences of operating armored forces beneath hostile air power. Soviet tank design philosophy, which had dominated global armored vehicle development for decades, began its decline. The compromises that made sense when air superiority was assumed became liabilities when that assumption proved false. But for Iraqi tank crews who survived the Devil's Cross, these doctrinal lessons meant nothing. They had learned something more fundamental, more personal, more permanent. You could hear it coming, and hearing it meant you had seconds to choose. Stay inside the armor that was supposed to protect you and die, or abandon everything you were trained to believe and run. Most chose to run. The ones who stayed became statistics. In Part 3, we will examine what happened when the war ended, but the nightmares did not. We will learn how American pilots processed the destruction they inflicted. We will discover why the Air Force nearly killed the aircraft that had proven itself beyond any doubt. And we will see how veterans from both sides carried Desert Storm with them for the rest of their lives. The sound of the GAU-8 faded over the Kuwaiti desert in February 1991. For those who heard it, that sound never truly stopped. In parts 1 and 2, we witnessed the birth of a nightmare. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, an aircraft designed around a 7-barrel cannon that fired 65 depleted uranium rounds per second. We saw Iraqi tank crews learn that Soviet doctrine meant nothing when death came from above. We watched the Devil's Cross turn T-72 tanks into burning coffins across Kuwait. But the war was not over, and the worst was yet to come. By February 25, 1991, Iraqi forces understood they were losing. Coalition ground troops had crossed into Kuwait. Republican Guard divisions that were supposed to hold defensive lines for months crumbled within hours. The air campaign had broken the Iraqi military before the first American tank fired a shot. Now came the retreat. Iraqi commanders in Kuwait City received orders from Baghdad. Withdraw immediately. Save what forces you can. Abandon equipment if necessary. Get out before coalition forces cut off escape routes to Basra. The order triggered the largest military traffic jam in modern history. Highway 80 stretched northwest from Kuwait City toward the Iraqi border. 6 lanes of modern highway, built with Kuwaiti oil money, the fastest route home for Iraqi forces desperate to escape the killing ground Kuwait had become. By midnight on February 25th, that highway had become a parking lot of death. Thousands of vehicles packed the road. T-72 tanks, T-62 tanks, BMP armored personnel carriers, military trucks loaded with ammunition and supplies, civilian vehicles commandeered during the occupation, stolen cars, buses, fire trucks. Everything that could move joined the desperate flight north. Iraqi commanders made a critical miscalculation. They believed darkness would protect them. They believed coalition aircraft could not effectively engage moving targets at night. They believed that if they moved fast enough, they could reach the border before sunrise brought the Devil's Cross back into the sky. They were wrong about everything. American E-8 Joint Stars aircraft detected the convoy forming before the first vehicle left Kuwait City. Airborne radar tracked thousands of heat signatures converging on Highway 80. Within minutes, strike packages were being assembled at bases across Saudi Arabia. The first aircraft arrived over the highway at 100 hours. F-15E Strike Eagles dropped cluster munitions on vehicles at the front of the column. Explosions blocked the road. Vehicles behind slammed into wreckage. The convoy stopped. Then came more bombs at the rear of the column. More explosions. More blockages. More vehicles trapped. Thousands of Iraqi soldiers found themselves caught on an open highway with nowhere to go. Ahead, burning wreckage. Behind, burning wreckage. On either side, flat desert offering no cover, no concealment, no hope. And above them, the sound began. A-10 Warthogs arrived over Highway 80 at 03:47 hours. 8 aircraft in the first wave, each carrying 1,174 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium ammunition. Each pilot seeing something they had never witnessed before, a target-rich environment that stretched to the horizon. Captain Eric Salomonson rolled his A-10 inverted and looked down through his canopy. Below him, vehicle headlights created a river of light extending for miles in both directions. Thermal imaging showed hundreds of heat signatures. Tanks with engines running. Trucks packed together. Targets everywhere. He rolled upright, established his dive angle, centered his aiming point on a cluster of tanks near the middle of the column, and pressed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared. 130 rounds in 2 seconds. Depleted uranium penetrators streaking toward thin top armor at 1,000 meters per second. Impacts. Explosions. Secondary detonations as ammunition cooked off inside burning vehicles. Salmonson pulled up and circled for another pass. Below him, 3 tanks burned. Crews scrambled from hatches. Some made it. Most did not. His wingman rolled in on the next target cluster. More cannon fire. More explosions. More burning vehicles, adding to the chaos below. The A-10s worked methodically, selecting target groups, rolling in, firing, pulling up, circling, repeating. Each pass left more wreckage. Each pass killed more vehicles. Each pass added to the growing inferno that lit the desert night. Iraqi soldiers abandoned their vehicles and ran into the desert. Some threw down weapons and raised hands toward aircraft they could barely see. Some simply lay in ditches and prayed. Some died running. The attacks continued through the night. Fresh A-10 flights arrived as earlier aircraft exhausted ammunition and returned to base. The rotation never stopped. As one pair of warthogs departed, another pair arrived. The sound of the GAU-8 echoed across the desert continuously for hours. By dawn, Highway 80 had ceased to exist as a road. In its place stretched a corridor of destruction that photographers would capture for newspapers around the world. Burned hulks of vehicles packed so tightly that in some places you could walk from one end of the column to the other without touching the ground. Tanks with turrets blown off. Trucks reduced to skeletal frames. Personal belongings scattered across the pavement. Evidence of flight so desperate that soldiers had abandoned everything to run. The images shocked the world. Some called it a massacre. Others called it legitimate military action against enemy forces in retreat. The debate would continue for decades. But the numbers told their own story. Coalition aircraft destroyed more than 1,500 vehicles on Highway 80 in a single night. A-10s accounted for approximately 400 of those kills. Individual pilots reported destroying 10, 15, even 20 vehicles in single missions. Ammunition expenditure reached levels that strained logistics systems designed for weeks of combat, not hours. Iraqi casualties remained difficult to calculate. Many vehicles were empty when struck. Crews had abandoned them and fled into the desert, but hundreds of bodies were recovered from the wreckage. Hundreds more were never found. The highway of death became the defining image of Desert Storm. It represented everything the air campaign had accomplished: total dominance, overwhelming firepower, the complete destruction of an enemy's ability to fight. And at the center of that destruction, the aircraft Iraqi crews feared most: the Devil's Cross. News of Highway 80 spread through remaining Iraqi units within hours. Radio intercepts revealed commanders ordering troops to abandon vehicles immediately if aircraft appeared overhead. Tank crews received permission to surrender rather than face continued air attack. Entire battalions laid down arms without firing a shot. The psychological collapse that had begun in the first weeks of the air campaign became complete. Iraqi soldiers who had survived 8 years of brutal warfare against Iran, who had endured human wave attacks and chemical weapons, and some of the bloodiest fighting since World War II, refused to continue fighting. Not because they lacked courage, because they understood the mathematics. Fighting meant dying. Surrendering meant living. The choice required no consideration. Coalition ground forces advancing through Kuwait encountered scenes that defied military logic. Defensive positions with weapons still loaded, ammunition still stacked, soldiers simply gone. Tank revetments with vehicles intact, but crews vanished. Entire units that existed on paper, but had ceased to exist in reality. Intelligence officers estimated that Iraqi combat effectiveness dropped by 50% in the 48 hours following Highway 80. Not from casualties, from desertion, from psychological collapse, from the simple human refusal to face weapons that could not be fought. The 100-hour ground war that followed was less a battle than a collection operation. Coalition forces swept through Kuwait, gathering prisoners, securing oil facilities, and documenting the scale of destruction that air power had inflicted. When ceasefire took effect on February 28, 1991, the Iraqi military that had invaded Kuwait 7 months earlier had effectively ceased to exist. Final tallies revealed the scope of coalition air power's achievement. More than 3,700 Iraqi tanks destroyed. More than 2,400 armored vehicles destroyed. More than 2,600 artillery pieces destroyed. Iraqi Air Force eliminated. Iraqi Navy eliminated. Iraqi command and control systems shattered. A-10 Warthogs claimed credit for 987 tanks, 926 artillery pieces, 1,106 trucks, 501 armored personnel carriers, 249 command posts, 96 radar installations, 72 bunkers, 50 surface-to-air missile sites, 28 command and control facilities, 11 Scud missile launchers, and 9 aircraft destroyed on the ground. These numbers made the A-10 the most effective tank-killing platform of the war. More effective than Apache helicopters. More effective than F-111 bombers. More effective than the M1 Abrams tanks that were supposed to be the primary anti-armor weapon. An aircraft that Air Force leadership had nearly canceled. An aircraft designed for a European war that never happened. An aircraft some generals considered obsolete before it ever saw combat. That aircraft had just proven itself beyond any possible doubt. American pilots who flew over Highway 80 processed their experience in different ways. Some described professional satisfaction at accomplishing their mission effectively. Others struggled with images that would stay with them for years. Captain Salomonson later reflected on what he had seen. The burning vehicles, the running figures, the knowledge that his cannon had killed men whose faces he would never see. He had trained for years to do exactly what he did that night. He had done it well. Whether that made it easier or harder to live with depended on factors he was still working through decades later. But for Iraqi survivors, Highway 80 became something else entirely. It became proof of what they had learned in the weeks before, that the A-10 represented a threat beyond their ability to comprehend or counter, that the sound of the GAU-8 meant death, that the Devil's Cross hunted them with an efficiency that seemed almost personal. Veterans of Highway 80 described the experience as the worst night of their lives. Worse than anything in the Iran-Iraq War. Worse than chemical attacks. Worse than the human wave assaults that had killed millions over 8 years. Because in those earlier battles, they could fight back. They could shoot at enemies they could see. They could feel that their fate remained partially in their own hands. On Highway 80, there was no fighting back. There was only the sound, the fire, the running, the praying, the dying, and the knowledge that somewhere above, in aircraft they could barely see, American pilots were systematically destroying everything Iraq had sent to Kuwait. The war ended 3 days after Highway 80. The ceasefire brought silence to the desert for the first time in 6 weeks. But the story of the A-10 and the men who flew it, and the men who died beneath it, was not finished. Because wars end, but what wars do to people never truly ends. In Part 4, we will discover what happened when the guns fell silent. We will learn how the Air Force nearly killed the aircraft that had saved so many American lives. We will meet the pilots who struggled to reconcile their professional success with its human cost. And we will hear from Iraqi survivors who still cannot sleep when they remember that sound. The Devil's Cross had earned its name. Now came the reckoning. In Part 1, we met the weapon that would terrorize Iraqi tank crews. A 7-barrel cannon built into an aircraft. Depleted uranium rounds fired at 65 per second, the sound of death itself. In Part 2, we watched Iraqi forces struggle to counter a threat their doctrine never anticipated. The Devil's Cross hunted them without mercy. Soviet tank design became a death sentence. In Part 3, we witnessed Highway 80, the largest single destruction of armored vehicles in modern warfare. The night that broke the Iraqi military's will to fight. Now comes the final chapter, the one nobody expected. Because when the guns fell silent over Kuwait, the story of the A-10 Thunderbolt II was far from over. The aircraft that had proven itself beyond any doubt faced a new enemy, an enemy more dangerous than any Iraqi air defense system. The United States Air Force wanted to kill it, and the men who flew it, and the men who survived it, would carry that sound with them for the rest of their lives. Captain Eric Solomonson returned from Desert Storm as a decorated combat veteran. He had flown 38 missions over Kuwait and Iraq. He had destroyed more enemy vehicles than most pilots would see in an entire career. He had earned the reputation every A-10 pilot dreamed of. But reputation could not silence what he heard at night. The sound of the GAU-8. The sight of burning vehicles on Highway 80. The knowledge that inside those vehicles, men had died because he pressed a trigger from 4,000 feet above. Solomonson was not unusual. Many A-10 pilots who flew combat missions during Desert Storm reported similar experiences. They had trained for years to do exactly what they did. They had done it extraordinarily well. They had saved American lives by destroying enemy armor before ground forces engaged. But killing at industrial scale leaves marks that metals cannot cover. Some pilots processed the experience and moved forward. They understood that war required terrible actions, and that their actions had been necessary and legal and effective. They took pride in their skills while acknowledging the human cost. Others struggled longer. The disconnect between professional success and personal doubt created tensions that took years to resolve. Counseling helped some. Time helped others. Some never fully reconciled what they had accomplished with what it meant. On the other side of the battlefield, Iraqi survivors faced different demons. Sergeant Hassan al-Rashidi, who had watched his tank platoon die around him on February 25th, returned to a shattered Iraq. The army that had employed him no longer existed in any meaningful form. The country he had served lay in ruins. The future he had imagined had been erased. He found work as a mechanic, engines and transmissions. The skills he had learned maintaining T-72 tanks translated to civilian vehicles well enough. He married. He had children. He built something resembling a normal life. But certain sounds triggered memories he could not control. Power tools with high-pitched whines. Industrial equipment operating at certain frequencies. Anything that approximated the mechanical roar of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon. When those sounds reached his ears, he was back in the desert, back in the sand, back watching his friends burn inside vehicles that were supposed to protect them. Iraqi veterans' experiences went largely undocumented in the years following Desert Storm. The chaos of post-war Iraq, the sanctions, the subsequent conflicts, all pushed individual trauma into the background of larger catastrophes. But researchers who eventually interviewed survivors found consistent patterns. The A-10 had left psychological wounds that physical injuries could not match. Veterans described the aircraft as uniquely terrifying because it combined visibility with inevitability. You saw it coming, you heard it coming, and you could do absolutely nothing to stop what happened next. This combination created trauma responses that differed from other combat experiences. Artillery was random. Missiles struck without warning. But the A-10 gave you just enough time to understand your death was approaching, while denying any possibility of preventing it. That narrow window between awareness and helplessness proved psychologically devastating in ways that instant death was not. But the legacy of the A-10 extended far beyond individual trauma. The aircraft that had proven itself so dramatically in Desert Storm faced immediate threats to its existence. Air Force leadership had never fully embraced the Warthog. It was slow. It was ugly. It lacked the technological sophistication that defined modern air power doctrine. It could not achieve air superiority or penetrate defended airspace or strike targets from beyond visual range. What it could do was kill tanks. But with the Cold War over and Soviet armored columns no longer threatening Western Europe, some generals questioned whether that mission still justified a dedicated aircraft. Budget pressures intensified the debate. The Air Force wanted funding for F-22 Raptors and B-2 bombers, and the advanced systems that would define 21st century air power. The A-10 competed for resources that leadership preferred to allocate elsewhere. Retirement proposals emerged almost immediately after Desert Storm. The aircraft that had just destroyed more enemy armor than any platform in history faced decommissioning within years of its greatest triumph. Congress intervened. Lawmakers who had seen the footage from Kuwait, who had heard testimony from ground commanders about close air support that saved American lives, refused to let the Air Force eliminate its most effective tank killer. The A-10 survived. Barely. It would fly again over Kosovo in 1999, over Afghanistan after 2001, over Iraq again in 2003. Each conflict demonstrated capabilities that no other aircraft could match. Long loiter time over battlefields, heavy weapons loads, the ability to absorb damage that would destroy other aircraft and still return home. Pilots brought A-10s back with holes in wings, with engines destroyed, with hydraulic systems shot away. The aircraft's legendary survivability saved crews who would have died in more fragile platforms. And always, the GAU-8 remained the centerpiece. Generations of enemies learned what Iraqi tank crews had learned in 1991. That sound meant death. That the aircraft called Warthog by Americans carried a weapon specifically designed to destroy armored vehicles from angles where armor provided no protection. Taliban fighters in Afghanistan called it different names, but the fear it inspired remained consistent across cultures and conflicts. The A-10 had become something more than an aircraft. It had become a psychological weapon whose reputation preceded its arrival. The deeper lessons of the A-10 story extend beyond military technology. The Warthog represented a bet against conventional wisdom. In an era when speed and altitude and stealth dominated air power thinking, engineers designed an aircraft that was slow and flew low and made no attempt at concealment. They prioritized firepower and survivability over characteristics that defined modern fighters. That bet paid off because the designers understood their mission with absolute clarity. Kill tanks. Everything else was secondary. Every design decision served that single purpose. This focus produced an aircraft that was genuinely ugly by conventional standards, but extraordinarily effective at its intended role. The lesson applies far beyond military procurement. Organizations that understand their core mission with perfect clarity can make unconventional choices that proved superior to conventional alternatives. The A-10 also demonstrated that innovation can come from unexpected directions. The aircraft emerged from requirements written by officers who had studied Soviet armor and understood its vulnerabilities. They asked a simple question: what would it take to exploit weaknesses that Soviet designers had accepted as necessary compromises? The answer was a gun so powerful that engineers had to build an airplane around it. An answer that seemed absurd until it proved devastatingly effective. Throughout military history, similar patterns repeat. Ideas dismissed as impossible, or impractical, or crazy, prove transformative when circumstances align. The men who championed those ideas faced skepticism and resistance, and sometimes ridicule, before events validated their vision. The A-10's designers and advocates experienced this pattern. They persisted through decades of institutional doubt. They watched their aircraft prove itself in exactly the scenario it was designed for. They saw it survive repeated attempts at retirement. And here is the detail that most histories overlook. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon that terrorized Iraqi tank crews was designed in the late 1960s. The penetration figures and rate of fire and depleted uranium ammunition that made it so effective against T-72 tanks in 1991 had been calculated 30 years earlier. American engineers had designed a weapon specifically to exploit vulnerabilities in Soviet tank armor before those tanks were even deployed in significant numbers. They had predicted with remarkable accuracy how future armored vehicles would be constructed and where they would be weakest. The A-10 was not a response to a discovered vulnerability. It was an anticipation of a vulnerability that its designers knew would exist. This represented engineering foresight of extraordinary quality. The men who wrote the requirements and designed the weapon and built the aircraft had imagined a future conflict with precision that actual events validated almost exactly. They had designed for a war in Europe that never happened. Their creation proved itself instead against Soviet equipment operated by Iraqi crews in Middle Eastern deserts. The specific scenario differed. The fundamental matchup remained exactly what they had anticipated. 30 years of development, 6 weeks of combat, 900 tanks destroyed. That is the equation that defines the A-10 Thunderbolt II. From a requirement written when Vietnam still raged, through decades of Cold War preparation, to the burning highways of Kuwait. An aircraft designed to kill Soviet tanks, killed Soviet tanks operated by a different army in a different war on a different continent. The designers never knew exactly how their creation would be used, but they understood the problem they were solving with such clarity that their solution remained valid across decades and circumstances. Iraqi tank crews who faced the Devil's Cross in 1991 were fighting a weapon designed before many of them were born. They were dying to engineering decisions made in conference rooms they would never see, by men they would never meet. And they were hearing a sound that would follow them forever. You could hear it coming. That phrase echoed through Iraqi veterans' accounts for years after Desert Storm. It captured everything the A-10 represented. The warning that arrived too late. The knowledge that preceded death by seconds. The helplessness of facing a threat beyond your ability to counter. American soldiers heard something different in that same sound. They heard salvation. Close air support arriving when ground forces needed it most. The distinctive roar that meant enemy armor would burn and friendly troops would live. The same sound, two completely different meanings, separated by nothing more than which side of the cannon you stood on. The A-10 remains in service today, upgraded and modernized, but still built around that same 7-barrel cannon, still carrying depleted uranium rounds, still making that same sound. Somewhere, in bases across America, pilots trained to fly missions their predecessors flew over Kuwait. They learn the same attack profiles. They practice the same gunnery techniques. They prepare for conflicts they hope will never come. And somewhere, in countries that operate armor descended from Soviet designs, tank crews study what happened on Highway 80. They learn about the aircraft with two tails. They hear recordings of the GAU-8. And they understand what Iraqi crews learned at terrible cost. When you hear that sound, you have seconds to live. 900 tanks, 6 weeks of combat. One aircraft designed for exactly this purpose. That is the legacy of the A-10 Thunderbolt II. The Warthog. The Devil's Cross. The sound of death that never truly stopped.